I have a lot of power. So this is Skinner's bill. It is also sitting on the governor's desk. It started out a lot heftier and it's been kind of winnowed down a little bit. But this is on for the CalFresh work groups, very similar things we've already done, but kind of creating these dashboards, we can kind of monitor how things are going. AB 2004 by Christina Garcia. This was a kind of this was more of an equity issue. Students are allowed to borrow, certain amounts, but if you're a Dream Loan participant, you had a limit on what you could borrow, which inhibited your ability to get more post-education. So this is currently sitting on the governor's desk to increase that limit to 40,000. While we don't like to have anything that increases loan debt, this did see more of this as an equity. Both are from Lamone, Senator Lamone, and they are regarding AB 540 students. One is already enrolled. It was one was already chaptered, and it was sitting. It was a Senate joint resolution to kind of recognize the anniversary of AB 540 students. The first, SB 1141, expands the number of students that would not qualify. And this has been enrolled. It is currently waiting for signature. That's not me. It's a different date. Okay, now for ones with direct impact. Here we go. The first by Assemblywoman Waldron, AB 2661. This extended the law enforcement kind of grant to tribal law enforcement and firefighters. So they would be eligible. Their dependents are eligible for certain grants, as non-tribal firefighters' dependents are if they are wounded or killed in the line of duty. AB 2880 extends the sunset on the tax credit. We were able to actually kind of be part of this because sometimes the awards are for the Cal Grant B students were like $1, and then they were actually underwritten by the general fund. So we're hoping to do more work on this, but we did actually add some things to the bill to make it a lot easier for our agency to administer. Any questions?
Let me just add that for those of you who've been on the commission for a while, and I'm looking at Commissioner Giog and Cifuentes, this was at one point, this actually did provide an offset or an additional supplement to the Cal Grant B as discussed. And it's an area that I would put a pin on to look at how we can streamline this, promote it, and make it a much more effective source of revenue to address a priority that isn't fully being addressed by the state general fund. So I just call your attention to that, important to monitor. And I think it's something that this commission at some point in the future may want to look at. How do we leverage this resource? And if it is something that's it's addressing a major issue or a critical priority, let's promote it.
Well, we did discover a couple of elements with its major decrease. One is 2019 and the previous administration's tax cuts. They no longer made it very attractive. So it went from getting like $4 million a year to $1 million. So it took a huge hit. Other is it's really hard to get this credit. Like if I, as a person, want to get this credit, I have to call the treasurer's office, ask for a certificate, then make a donation, then wait for the certificate, then send the certificate with my tax credit. Instead of like normal kind of like tax, donations you make where you just make a donation, you have a receipt, and then you claim all your tax deductions. We've made a couple of recommendations to Vanta's office already, like maybe choosing a smaller subgroup of people that would make it a little more substantial. And they are interested in working with us next year to kind of enhance it, to make it actually because we mentioned it was only getting like $1 per person. They're like, well, that can't be. And I'm like, it is. There's the data. We love data. What's up? Did you have anyone down that?
I think you just hit on the last point I was going to add, which is that in part because of our success at expanding Cal Grant B award access, that meant that there's more students to stretch fewer dollars across, and that's why we started to consider, are there other targeted populations where you could go deeper with an award across fewer students, leveraging this revenue source? And I think there'll be a continued conversation around how do you try to address the tax structure issues that made this a less utilized tax credit and try to better promote it so that folks who do want to contribute to this have an opportunity to. So thus far, the treasurer's office has been pretty open to those suggestions and went with the legislation this year to make sure it wouldn't sunset and the code just wouldn't disappear. But already you're having some discussion about what this could look like next year to further refine.
SB 20 by Senator Dodd really actually just codified something we are already doing, notifying TANF students of the different benefits they're eligible for. That was just codifying something, our practice. These two bills are included, they are both sitting on the governor's desk. Mr. Villapua's bill and Ms. Reyes' bill both had an impact previously to the commission. One establishing the home health aid and the other for mental health services, but both later on were in amendments assigned to other agencies, so it no longer impacts our agency. AB 2295 by Joan Sawyer was held in the Senate Appropriations. It came to us very late. Once it left the first house, then it added on that the commission should convene a working group to create a kind of a tuition-free environment. That's why it was held in suspense in the Senate. SB 851 got amended. It was a bill that was going to add some additional kind of abilities for independent colleges. It is addressed in the budget, which Jake will be going over, but we did want to not leave this out since it has been a topic of discussion among the commission, but it is no longer anything to do with education or commission. SB 1229 also will be coming up in the budget, but this expanded the Golden State Teacher Grant to include mental health and pupil and personnel services credentials. The Golden State Teacher Grant is already something that we obviously have, and then we're just expanding the application to include this area. Any questions on the Golden State Teacher Grant expansion? And that's all. Any questions on state stuff?
If I could just briefly add, I just want to, not to the legislation, I think you did a great job covering that, but I just want to thank Alex and thank our team for all the work on the legislative agenda this session that just came to a conclusion. We had a really successful year when you look at both of our sponsored legislations, Cal Grant Reform Act and this proposal around philanthropic funding that we've been making several attempts around. As some commissioners may recall, we were trying to do that through the budget process. This year took a different procedural route and introduced this as a bill so it could have more visible and more thorough consideration and wasn't on a laundry list of budget actions. In addition to those two bills, Alex and Daniela and Rosa especially were also managing what you would recall was initially in that first bingo board we debuted of this year, felt like dozens of bills that were college affordability and financial aid focused. And through our engagement, we were able to not only convey some of the administrative considerations we have at CSAC, but also try to, in some instances, take that interest and put it towards a direction that we think will actually help us better hit the mark in terms of what we do for students and the work we're trying to carry out at the commission. So that list of many bills, some of which were addressed in the budget, others you will see were redirected elsewhere. That's really attributable in large part to how commission staff, Alex, Danielle, and Rosa were able to engage on our behalf. So I just wanted to thank and recognize them for their work this session. And then of course, pause once more for any questions on everything we just considered or you saw in the attachments on state legislation before we move ahead to the federal update.
But just a question around definition. I'm learning as we go. I've never seen gut been amended. I don't know what that means.
So it is like imagine fishing. They take out everything that has to do with the bill because there's only a finite number of numbers they kind of work through the process. And if they find, especially Senator Portino, all of his content of his original 851 was included in the budget. So we didn't really need the bill number anymore. So somebody else had an idea later on that was like, hey, I have an idea without a bill number. Can I take your bill number? So they take out all the guts and put in there, like restoring a car.
Gotcha. Okay.
I'm fishing.
Great question. Are there any other questions from commissioners?
Just a comment, just adding to the appreciation for staff and we got the news around Cal Grant reform, seems like years ago. And then we're not barely meeting, and I wish we could time our meetings to coincide with those good news. And I just want to appreciate, the long road continues. We're by no means there yet, but to be at this stage, I mean, there are periods where it was all in question, and just want to, it takes tenacity, it takes persistence, and a lot of skill that this team has to get to where we're at. And just want to congratulate staff and, motivate us to continue until we see it all the way through. And we have a lot of people to thank in the legislature and the governor's office and the stakeholders who weighed in. But I know that this is a little bit like stale news, but it feels fresh because we're now in each other's presence and get to celebrate.
Great, thank you for that comment.
Oh,
Any other questions?
can I make a comment, Chair Niece?
Pardon?
It's hard to see.
No, I was just seeing if there was any other questions. I wanted to thank Commissioner Mayor for his comment and see if there were any other questions.
I did. Can I have a question? Ask a question? Okay, thank you. Just echo, thank you. I think it's relentless patience too. And I mean, you both of you, just thank you for everything to get this through and continue the conversations. And now it's like we have it now. What are we gonna do? How do we roll this out, right? It's the next step. My question is, and I know maybe not the top of your head, but something to think about, or maybe you heard just in conversations when pushing anything around housing for students, or conversations around housing or something brewing. And so I'm gonna give you a scenario that I'm dealing with right now to kind of help understand, and not so much if it's necessarily our role, but what's next step. So I have a foster youth student who's going to UC Riverside. And when we reached out to her to see if she needs anything, because we're doing like kind of move-in mentors, because they think they don't need anything, but when you don't know what you need for a dorm room, you never moved in a dorm room, and sometimes you never have these items. And so we're really intentionally going and supporting our foster youth and our homeless students. And this particular student, she's living off campus. And I said, why are you living off campus? Like, you should be on campus and experiencing it. And she says, well, my social worker says it's better if I go to this apartment because I can get Section 8 housing. And so I understand that, right? Because so she doesn't go into debt. Let's say she would take out some loans to pay for some of the dorms. But then here's an example of like, she's off campus, she's 5 blocks away, she's isolated. So I'm trying to understand like Section 8 housing more. So I was just wondering if you've heard of anything or any buzzing for housing specifically for students, and maybe that's the first step, the homeless and foster youth students, let's say.
The short answer, Chair Cifuentes, is yes. There's definitely a lot of discussion about that. I mean, and you read the headlines too. I think housing is one of the issues that first and foremost the legislature and governor are trying to address for California, broadly speaking. But I think that there's also a recognition that for students, they face different and sometimes more acute challenges in trying to access housing. When you think about the other considerations that they need to make, a lot of the same type of discussion we've had about access to CalFresh and that we had through the work group, where yes, there are these broader issues that affect everybody who lives in California, and then there's a separate set of issues that affects our students, particularly when they're in that transitional age, going from one setting and trying to establish some roots in community in a new place sometimes, or just in a new setting. One thing that I could point to that we could talk about more tomorrow if it's helpful during the budget update is that this has been an area of pretty significant investment for the state over the past 2 years. We're now at over $2 billion that have been appropriated towards construction, acquisition, or renovation of student housing specifically for low-income students. And those are funds that are being released by the Department of Finance to public institutions on an annual basis. I think this is in large part, I think, what you hear the governor's administration so often talking about, bending the cost curve for higher education and looking at some of these drivers of total cost of attendance that, yes, we need to provide more direct support now to respond to the immediate need, but there's also, I think, a recognition that there will need to be an increase in the scale of housing that's made available to students. And that's a more medium-term, longer-term solution, but one where you have to look at both of those levers. So I think you more often will see it addressed in the budget space than in legislation. just because it does require that investment in order to either provide the direct support to students or to finance the construction of housing. But, I just today was reading about several different housing proposals that have gone through and have gone on the governor's desk that are trying to address development more broadly. So, yeah, I think that'll be an area where it'll be interesting to see how they come back next year and try to build on what they've just done.
Awesome, well, and I want you to know I have 48 students that were homeless or fosters going to UC Riverside. One was that situation, the other foster student living on campus. All of the rest need food, CalFresh, services, vouchers. So I'm using all the things we've done to connect all the different departments to help. So I just want to say thank you because I get to see the direct impact of what you do. And these conversations, it's like they're responding, our UC partners are, okay, yeah, we gotta figure this out. Vouchers, Cal State San Marcos, really responding, and that's that power of that data sharing piece too. So I just wanna say thank you for that, because I get to see those faces when I get to connect them with those resources, and I'm like, I promise you, we're trying to streamline them, And so it's powerful, but definitely, just for that budget, because I just think there's so many opportunities there. And she needs all the help she can get. She needs to be close to campus. She's gonna be 5 blocks away. And how do we coordinate that for at least those greatest need students that we've been taking care of for, 17 years as a state already, right?
Well, it also kind of appeared in Senator Cortez's bill on guaranteed income. It was the first time they kind of mentioned how you kind of help students from their 12th grade to make all those housing deposits. I remember when I sent my girls off to college, $500 by May 1st, or when they lose their spot in housing. And that was almost like a piece that people hadn't thought of, like, oh yeah, who can write a check for $500? It's like you're living paycheck. I think that piece resonated with some as well, that maybe needed addressed. His bill wasn't the way to do it, but that was the need that came up.
And then usually they'll waive it if they have zero expected family contribution, but if they outsource some of their housing to third parties, then they can't do that. And then that's when you have to pay the money. It doesn't matter if you're foster youth, homeless youth, you have to find the resources. Yeah,
So I have a question about the Section 8 housing. I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting idea whether or not there's any way to leverage that Section 8 housing as a way to fund low cost or not having to pay those deposits especially for students who are foster youth and homeless. And do we know if there's ever been a look at whether those are federal resources and whether they can be leveraged for this kind of specific targeted use? And I know we don't want a foster youth homeless dormitory, but if there's a creative way to utilize that funding that you could totally subsidize the cost and it wouldn't come out of the pockets of the universities because they have businesses to run too, which is always the rub. But I'm just wondering if we've heard anything about that.
So I will hazard, I'm going to go out on a shaky territory here because I haven't worked around Section 8 issues in a few years, but when I was a constituent services manager in a congressional office, it was one of the beats that I worked. There may be commissioners around the table who know more about this than I do, but at that time at least, there were pretty significant wait lists to receive a voucher. And then once you access a voucher, some challenges in where you could utilize it. So unlike something like CalFresh, where that's an entitlement, like we talk about Cal Grant, where you're eligible and you apply and go through that process, you have it. It's not quite that same access point. So it may be a resource that we could better leverage for students. It may not have that immediate resource infusion that we would love to see with CalFresh. There may be a few additional steps in that process or some wait times if we were to explore around Section 8. So it's not something I've seen a lot of discussion around before, but could definitely be something that we look into further to see if that's changed. Or I don't know if any commissioners, I don't want to put commissioners on the spot here, but they may have something that they could offer around that.
Well, I'll just add quickly, I think that there is an opportunity for foster youth in particular to get stipends for their apartment and cost of living that can apply actually to their residence hall payments. And so I think what can happen is sometimes a social worker might guide them down a pathway around Section 8 housing versus guide them down a pathway of exploring options to get resources to help cover their housing. So you can actually get a stipend as a former foster youth up until age 21 that helps to cover your cost of an apartment. And that can also include the payments for your residence hall. And so I think the other piece that we might need to think about is how do we expand the conversations in a way that more people know about the resources that might actually be available to foster and former foster youth. So
just regarding federal law, where in my previous life, I did have something to do with affordable housing, but it was more in tax credits rather than Section 8. And I have a memory that a lot of the federal housing programs can't be used for on-campus student housing. And I'm more than willing to do some research and see and confirm that. I also was just Googling during this conversation and read something that if you're under 24, unless you're married or meet some other exception, you don't qualify for Section 8. So I think there are things in federal law that make this more challenging for students and for on-campus housing, but I'm happy to do some research and see what we can identify about what those limits are at the federal level.
yes,
We're done with that. I do
Dr.
have a
Moore.
question, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to go back to SB 1229 with the mental health. I was just wondering if there's a possibility that we can look at how can we leverage it more with the post-pandemic recovery? Because as I'm reading this, it says for those students, postgraduate students and those encouraging them to work with nonprofits and educational agencies. I'm wondering if there is a way that somehow students that are studying in this space, because now with social and emotional learning, the students that are coming back after the recovery, now there's more visibility into those different studies beyond, psychology and social work. Now there's those curriculums where students are studying now in those programs to kind of help with those students. So if there's a way that we can kind of expose it, tie it into those students now that are kind of helping in that space, because there's already agencies out there now that are kind of helping to fill in that gap. Somehow if we can kind of connect those two.
Commissioner Doppelmore, I'm going to spoil some of the updates for tomorrow at the budget update, but you will be pleased to hear that actually the significant elements of this bill that I think align with your comments around trying to use this investment to help students who are in professional preparation programs to go into particularly mental health and counseling and those elements of the social emotional development for students in K-12 schools. That was included in budget changes to our Golden State Teacher Grant Program.
Okay.
So really now the teacher part of Golden State Teacher Grant is a little bit of a misnomer because it's going to be more inclusive now by bringing in the pupil services credentials.
Okay.
Those are the credential programs that counselors would receive. So now, and we've actually already, I'm spoiling Kay's update for our student impact and outreach committee, but we've already now made changes to the Golden State Teacher Grant Program to accept those students from those credential programs, just after these changes were enacted basically in July.
Okay.
So that application is now online. If folks are listening or have someone who's in one of those programs that they want to share this with, there are several other changes to the terms of the service commitment that those students make, but it was broad to include that. And that's why this slide notes that elements of the bill were included in the budget. This was the change. They didn't create a whole new program, but they took this investment we already have that we're already administering and modified it so that we can include that same target population of students who want to go into those professions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you refresh their memories on the benefit that these individuals would receive by participating in the program?
Thank you, Executive Director Garcia. This lets me continue our infomercial here for Golden State Teacher Grant. $20,000 in grant aid that a student can receive if they're in one of these programs, which is now any teacher credential program, any pupil services credential program. They eliminated the focus on high priority subject areas that some commissioners may recall. And now they've actually made the service commitment more flexible for the students. It'll be longer runway for us to administer at CSAC. So there is a staffing component to think about there. But now you take the $20,000, you're committing to serving for 4 years over an 8-year period at one of our priority schools, which is those schools are K-12 schools with 50% or more low income foster youth or English language learner students. So it basically added more time where students could complete the same number of years so that if they do move around from school site, that they could still complete that 4-year service commitment and not have to pay back any of the $20,000 that they receive for their grant.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a major new, opportunity to make these pathways more affordable, and that's true also for students who are in the undergrad programs that might be integrated with the credential program. So it's something that we are very actively working to get the word out about. So thank you for the opportunity to make the plug.
Yes, thank you.
Chair Nason,
Any other questions before we move on to the federal update? Oh, yes.
Just one more point to try to connect a few of these different initiatives, maybe some that are outside our wheelhouse at CSAC. I think this development in the Golden State Teacher Grant Program and expanding it to other people service credentials, it ties in very well with one of the major kind of signature investments that the governor has made in community schools. Billions of dollars, past $3 billion so far to help establish community schools across the state, which means schools that are integrated with all these different services. So I think the demand for these other people services is going to really increase dramatically. So it's great timing to be able to provide this $20,000 benefit so that we can actually, succeed on the promise of what a community school can provide. And so I'm encouraged by that broadening. I know that we need to follow that up with education and promotion. And also, I think it'd be good to be in communication with the Department of Education, the CDE, to understand the rollout of the community school initiative. The first set of grants have already gone out to many districts and schools. So it'll take a while to set it up, but hopefully we'll start seeing some of the students that benefited from this program be able to help connect with that larger initiative as well. And mental health is a huge component of community school.
Right. Any other questions or comments before we move on to the federal update? Seeing none, Jake, turn it back over to you.
All right, well, I'm now going to get to the big news that I think probably all of you have seen by now. And I believe that Executive Director Garcia sent out a notice around a couple weeks ago now already. But of course, probably the biggest development in the college affordability space since we last met was the news from President Biden about the administration's decision around the student loan payment pause and going even further, actually the cancellation of pretty significant amount of student debt that is already been incurred. So the easiest piece to explain here, the payment pause has extended until the end of the year. And the administration has also clarified this will be the last payment pause. So starting in 2023, payments on student loans will resume. Then, of course, there's the news that many had been waiting on with bated breath around the actual cancellation of debt and what the decision was by the administration there. Of course, the big discussion had been how far would the administration go in doing this, and would it be targeted, and to what degree would debt be canceled? The outcome here was that for borrowers with income under $125,000, there'd be $10,000 in their student loan debt canceled, irrespective of in which kind of program that debt was incurred. And then for students who had been Pell Grant recipients while they were enrolled, so trying to target this relief a little bit further, $20,000 for that student borrower would be canceled. There are not a lot of details about how this is going to be implemented that have been released quite yet. The news so far is that starting in October, there'd be some process where borrowers could ensure that they're already in the system, or that they're going to be able to be processed for cancellation. There was quite a lot of traffic at the FSA website, as you could imagine, and I think that's created some considerations for everybody about the availability of the FAFSA and making sure that as you have borrowers going on at the same time as students who are trying to apply for aid, that hopefully the bandwidth at FSA is going to be able to hold that. But some really significant news for actually the next slide, or one of the slides in a moment, we'll talk about the impact. Millions of borrowers, of course, in California and across the country who are going to benefit from this. And of course, I think the natural question is, what does this mean moving forward? And how do we all work to avoid students having to take out this kind of debt to finance their education moving ahead? Obviously, that's work we're doing here around our grant aid and making sure that that's accessible and available to students. The other piece of news that the president shared in this announcement was restructuring of the income-based repayment programs, actually pretty significant restructuring that will make this a more generous and viable pathway for students. Taking the current 10% of monthly income percentage going towards student loan repayment, and instead putting that at 5% of monthly discretionary income, and also making sure that there would be no payments triggered for anyone who's essentially making a $15 wage, that borrower wouldn't be in a place where they need to make a payment. There's essentially an income minimum before the 5% kicks in. And then finally, the forgiveness element, if after 10 years of making these 5% payments, there's a balance of student loan debt of $12,000 or less, that balance is canceled. So the details of how that's going to be administered are probably even less clear at this time than the loan cancellation. And I would not be surprised if there's some legal challenge to this before it is all carried out. But pretty significant direction to set for not only folks who already have taken out the debt, but moving forward, how do we try to make that a less burdensome load for student borrowers to carry after they graduate, or if they haven't graduated in particular, which was a significant number of the beneficiaries of this change were folks who had taken out debt, but didn't have a degree or credential to show for the time and the money that they put. And in terms of the national impact here, 43 million borrowers, number of borrowers in California is on the next slide. Really significant targeting because of how they've drawn the income threshold and the additional support available to Pell Grant students. So the statistics that have been released so far indicate that 90% of relief dollars actually go towards those who have been earning less than $75,000 a year. And now here's the slide on the impact for us in California. 4 million Californians who hold debt. The average, just over $38,000. That's for graduate and undergraduate. California does compare well nationally in terms of our debt for students who are exiting as undergraduates. We're third lowest in the country. Undergraduate debt is around $22,000. So the graduate debt does bump that up a peg, but as I noted previously, the cancellation is agnostic as to which kind of programs the debt was incurred for. So 92% of borrowers in California, when you look at the data, would be benefiting from this plan that the president's announced. So really significant news. As you can imagine, while we don't administer any loan program at the commission, we are a natural place for folks to try to get information and to learn more about this. Few details that there are that are online. So we have already started conversations amongst commission staff around what can we do using the data set that we have to, if it's not us, to direct students to the resources that are available and to make sure they know where they can stay tuned for further updates on this. And then of course, using the press inquiries as an opportunity to talk about, yes, this is major news. There's also all of this other aid for students who are still thinking about pursuing higher education that we want them to know about, that is that free money, that grant aid that we talk about that helps you avoid having to take out debt. On that note of the grant aid, Pell Grant proposals, not quite as major an update here, but did want to share with everyone some news around legislation we talked about previously. I'm actually going to start with the bottom bullet here. The CHIPS and Science Act was another one of these bills that the president signed into law during this summer period of actually quite a bit of legislation moving through before folks hunker down into election mode. You recall that there was previously an economic competitiveness bill that was going to make changes to the Pell Grant. That was the Compete Act, and it included what was effectively an extension of Pell Grant eligibility to short-term programs. Those certificate programs or programs that aren't even a whole semester, but can help benefit someone's job prospects or career skills, that was stripped out of the bill. The bill became much more targeted and frankly, much lower cost that ultimately went to the president's desk and was signed into law. So there's not really any current bill vehicle now for discussions around short-term Pell. But the flip part of that is the appropriation cycle continues. And at this point, so late in the game, I suspect it's very likely you won't see anything on the 2023 fiscal year for the federal budget until after the election. And that lame duck period when folks have been elected, there's some outgoing members who could take unpopular votes. And there's always the time pressure of the holidays. And that really seems to be a motivating factor for folks in DC. In the appropriations discussion, short-term Pell could pop up, hasn't yet. But what we know has been discussed is expansion of Pell Grant in terms of the award amount and looking at a $500 award amount increase. That's consistent across the House, Senate, and the President's plans. These have all been supported on a party line thus far. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some movement on that and if there's going to need to be some negotiation. The other point that we've heard there will very likely be negotiation around is the extension of Pell Grant eligibility to students who have DACA or TPS status. That's also been consistent in all of the Democratic proposals, but thus far seems to have a harder time getting traction with the other side of the aisle. So we're hopeful that that will stay in the final deal. We've advocated for that and submitted a signatories letter that you'd recall from a past meeting, but that seems to face a little bit of a steeper hill to climb than conversation around just increasing the maximum award that we make available to zero EFC students. So that is the federal update for now. I'll welcome any questions or comments on the news here.
Do we have any questions? The other piece I do know that they're looking at with some of the loan forgiveness stuff, Jake, is right now individuals in public service and teachers in public schools have opportunities for some loan forgiveness. They're looking at expanding that definition so that actually people who work in public higher education might qualify as well for some of that loan forgiveness. So I know that there's conversations about how are they defining that public service component and the opportunities for some potential loan forgiveness.
Chair Neese, since you mentioned that, I will also just make a plug for the continued availability for having your payments reassessed under public service loan forgiveness. This was another administration initiative. It's not always been a cleanly administered program, and many folks who've been trying to have their public service loan forgiveness payments count towards the 120 qualifying payments that results in elimination of your debt. They hadn't had their payments counted properly. The administration gave an opportunity for any borrower to have those payments reconsidered and to be made whole. That period ends at the end of October, and there was no extension of that reconsideration period that was part of the president's announcement. So it's not clear if that will be extended again or not. So if you know anyone who felt that they had not been properly treated by public service loan forgiveness, there is still an opportunity to be reconsidered. And probably a major need for us to all really think about how we can communicate with borrowers about the many different things that are happening to student loans and to forgiveness right now.
Yes, Chair Cifuentes.
Thank you. Any updates, do we have any updates on or news on verification and also conversations around verification and if that's where we're at with that or just preparing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know we've gotten some update on what FAFSA simplification will look like and that will affect verification. I haven't heard any major update on verification or any change recently, but that may be a question that our colleagues in programs could help provide a little more insight toward.
Just thinking ahead with the new requirement, way more, more students applying, submitting. And campuses being ready for that process to help students navigate, so.
Fantastic. Before we move on in the agenda, I also want to open it up for any public comment on this agenda item. So if there's any members of the public, now that we've had the full report, if there's any members of the public that would like to add public comment on this agenda item, please let me know. I am not seeing any. Fantastic. Well, thank you for that report and for the update. Moving on to agenda item number 6, then I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Director Meyer to give us an update on the budget.
Sheriff, I just had one quick comment I wanted to make before we move on.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So just wanted to acknowledge, you know, I'm a broken record when it comes to the independent college stuff. And just want to acknowledge the gratitude of seeing that put into the bills that have passed and all that. And I know that is in no small part to the conversations that you all have been having behind the scenes as well, along with AIICU, to push this forward. So just wanted, as much as I complain and bring up that point, I also wanted to acknowledge, you know, my gratefulness for seeing that with everything that's come through. So thank you all for that as well. Yes.
And I would like to add, Commissioner Gary, you have a partner, so so I would join the team with So the team is growing, and we appreciate your efforts for the independent colleges as well.
And an area where we'll have more good news to share tomorrow in that budget update where that happens.
I'd like to just, this was really a historic year for our government relations team, and Jake already talked about the significant team work that they accomplished, but I really want to let you know that they're real pros. Jake has assembled a team of pros, and they're relatively new to the GR world, and they've done a phenomenal job, not only at the state level, but also at the federal level. And the team has, and with Jake's leadership, have made a lot of important contacts at the federal level to help us keep track of what's going on there. And there's a lot going on at that level. For the past, many years, there hasn't been as much, but now there is. And so the team not only has kept up with a very aggressive state agenda, they're also keeping up with the federal agenda. So I just want to thank Jake and the entire team. They're real pros.
Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you. Happy to get to do good work with great people, so you can't really ask for more than that.
All right, great job. So any last comments before I move on to the next agenda item? And Commissioner Gary, I never think of you as complaining, so just to go on record. All right, with that said, I'll turn it over to Deputy Director Myers for the update on the budget.
Thank you so much. Good morning, commissioners and CSAC staff. Today, we're going to take this conversation a little more in-house and give you a year-end update of our state operations budget and how we landed in terms of our finances last year. My name is Lily Myers. I'm the Deputy Director for the Fiscal and Administrative Services Division, and co-presenting with me today is Sandy Melching, our Budget Officer. Before we begin, I do want to say big thanks to Sandy, who has maintained our state operations budget for the last 2 years, and it takes a tremendous level of effort and attention to detail to be able to land the ship of our finances every year so close to our appropriation amounts. So thank you, Sandy. What I have before you on the screen here is a high-level update of our prior year 2021 budget as it compares to our previous year. So you can see the significant increase in appropriation attributed to largely our Carve Out money for our new programs, which we'll dive into in some later slide decks here. And you can see that we have a $34 million budget against a $21.6 million budget from the year prior, which is about a $12 million increase in funds that we have to serve these new programs. We expended about $23.4 million versus the $21.5 million, just under $2 million increase from the year prior. And we ended the year last year with about $327,000 left, which was a liquidated balance that went back to the general fund. With that, we had a balance in our carve outs of about 10 million, which again, we'll talk about in some later slides. And then our position authority stayed stable between the last 2 fiscal years.
All right, thank you, Lily. Good morning, Chair Nice and commissioners and CSAC staff. I'm Sandy Melching, So this is a slide view of our 21-22 state operations, appropriations and obligations broken out by program area. Beginning on the left side, you'll see that the department's program names alongside their associated appropriations right next to it. And then next to that, you'll see the encumbrances, which these are the total encumbrances for each of those CSAC programs where we've committed funds either through a purchase order or through a contract. And then we have the ability to utilize those funds towards that contract for at least 2 more years, depending on the timing of the contract, what's designated within that contract time. Next, we have our expenditures, so what we've paid out towards each of those programs. And then lastly, the total committed column shows you, essentially it's the sum of the encumbrances and expenditures. So in our first row, we have the internal operations, which is just kind of like it's kind of like a catch-all, like all of our administrative costs fall under internal operations that's not directly associated with a program or a project. It includes a majority of our labor and our operating expenses for the department, which I'm going to cover a little bit more depth on the next slide. There's a few things I just wanted to point out for this side, from this slide. The first thing is the second line down is the grant delivery modernization system. So for this project, 2021 was the last year that we'd actually receive a direct appropriation for this project. In the eyes of DOF and CDT, this project is considered closed to them, although there's continuing enhancements going on. But for purposes of this project, it just says the GDSM project, it's closed. So from this point going forward, we're going to be getting a continuous appropriation that's just related to maintenance and operation for our GDS system. But we won't actually be tracking the GDS expenses anymore. It'll just be a part of our baseline budget from now on, that's $719,000. Next down, the cradle to career. So this is also a part of our baseline budget too, as a starting this year, it'll be an ongoing appropriation. And we received $150,000 to pay for a research specialist position for 22-23. And it's intended for that research specialist to participate in the Cradle to Career data program for our participation in creating a statewide data system that supports the education to employment pipeline. A few other things I just wanted to mention on this slide. The last 2 lines are our administrative carve out. So that's kind of what Lily had just touched on. So for those 3 carve outs, those carve outs are essentially a percentage of the local assistance appropriation that we receive. We're able to utilize that for administrative costs. So to pay for, personal services or O&E, really anything that supports that program, we're provided these funds to support that program. So I have I had another slide coming up that I go into a little more depth on these program carve outs, but just wanted to show you right here. This is what the initial carve outs that we received in 2021. And then for those 3 carve outs, we have an extended amount of time to utilize those funds. So for usually in a typical budget, you'd have 1 year to encumber or expend those funds, and then 2 years to spend those funds from an encumbrance. Whereas with these 3 carve outs, legislation has given us an extended amount of time to utilize those funds. So we didn't have to spend all of those funds in that first year that we received it. And like I said, I'll go into it a little bit more depth in a couple more slides. Next, I just wanted to mention our reimbursements down there. So that negative in the appropriations column, that negative 553,000, that is that's our reimbursement authority that Department of Finance provides for us. So we are allowed to request reimbursement from other state departments up to that amount. That's the most that the budget allows us to request reimbursement for services we perform on the behalf of other departments. But we technically can only bill the other departments up to our contractually agreed upon amount. So even if our authority was 553,000, we can only go up to that contract amount. And our contract amounts for our 3 programs where we receive reimbursement from, which is the Chafee program, the Military GI program, and the John R. Justice, those contract amounts don't actually reach that 553,000 threshold. The contracts only allow us to bill that to $455,011. So we did bill to the greatest extent that we possibly could to receive reimbursement for those programs. So when you take the total line, we've committed in 2021 about 23.5 million, and then subtracting out the reimbursements, then that left us with a total state operations that we paid out of pocket at $23 million. All right, so this is a slide view of our state operations broken up by spending category. So you can see again at that total committed bottom line, our total commitment is about $24 million. Here is where you can see the expenditures incurred and encumbered in 21-22. Right at the top is our personal services, where we have, it's pretty much a bulk of our spending comes from personal services at about 70% of our total spending. Personal services include expenditures, expenditure items that CSAC pays that really, it's like anything that we pay out to an employee would fall under personal services. So like salaries and benefits, and if we have to pay like workers' compensation claims or lump sum payments once a employee like leaves the state or leaves the department. Underneath that are our operating and expenses categories, starting with general services all the way down. The second largest type of spending we saw last year is under consulting and professional services. That's about 13% of our overall budget. And that's the category where all of our contracts reside. And then the next largest expense you see is the IT and consolidated data centers expenses, which that spending is really attributed to like our hardware and software costs, and then the CDT overhead that we pay, or I guess the overhead that we pay to CDT for things like cloud services and different programs that they provide to us. We have to pay CDT back. And then beyond that, really, we just have various line items which we've expended under 4% of our total operation budget for this year to support the commission. All right, so I wanted to put together a slide of our financial outlook. So where we're standing right now in the current year, 22-23. So this slide shows all of our appropriations that we received, as well as some carryover balances that from unspent funds from the carve outs. So starting at the top for the Learning Aligned Employment Program, we received an additional $2 million to support this program. This is on top of the $1 million that we received last year. So altogether to support this program, we received $3 million. I mentioned earlier about spending authority dates. So this one, we actually have the authority to spend that $3 million until June 30th, 3031. So kind of depending on the spending authority dates, we've budgeted some of these depending on how long we have to spend those. And I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide too. Next down, we have the Cal Grant reform, which we received. This is just a one-time appropriation of $500,000 to support costs that would be associated with Cal Grant reform, basically. So, it's things that we could spend on, like if we need to hire like LT positions or spend money on outreach for Cal Grant reform support. they didn't really give us any conditions around this money. It was kind of like right at the last minute. They provided this to us once the Cal Grant Reform Bill was passed. So this is just, it's like I said, it's just a one-time thing that we're going to get this year. We won't see this in next year's budget. Underneath that is internal operations. So like I said, everything that's not associated with a program or a project falls under internal operations. And then the next three programs down, the Chafee Military GI Bill Award and the John R. Justice, those are actually the contract amounts that I had added in there. So I didn't put in our reimbursement authority because, like I mentioned before, it doesn't necessarily align, but those are the amounts that we are allowed to request reimbursement for through those contracts. And then lastly, the three are the administrative carve out amounts that have been rolled over from last year. So those are monies that were unspent from the original carve out amount that we received that we can spend for an additional amount of time. So this is basically our starting point for 22-23, about almost $33 million to spend. All right, now on this slide, I kind of just wanted to touch a little bit on the carve outs and speak specifically on them. So kind of how I mentioned before, depending on the spending authority date, we've budgeted how we were going to spend these funds through either the remainder of the spending authority date or, you know, as needed, as the program needs it, we're spending them. The Golden State Teacher Grant Program, initially in 2021, we received the $7.5 million carve out. Last year, we spent about $1.4 million. This year, so we are forecasting to spend so far about $1.2 million, which will leave us about $4.5 million to spend by June 30th, 2026. Now, a majority of these funds were spent on labor. So we have been able to identify through kind of like a labor distribution process how much time an employee spends on a certain project and estimated that percentage to kind of span across all of the employees depending on what their piece is and charge it against their salaries. So we can basically charge their salaries to some of these carve outs. So a majority, when you see the total committed, a majority of that was spent for all three of those programs was towards personal services. However, we did have a couple contracts. So we had a couple IT contracts to help initiate some of the, I guess, the IT needs to build out these programs for our systems, as well as we had a couple consulting contracts for the Golden State Education and Training Grant Program to get that program off the ground. So we're currently prioritizing the rest of how we're going to be spending the remainder of these funds. But we know for certain for those three programs that for forecasted obligations, we'd like to spend that towards labor. And really in doing so, we are paying for a lot of our temp help positions doing that way. We currently have, well, actually, I should say, as of July 1st, we had 23 temp help on staff. So temp help are positions that aren't funded by Department of Finance, or they're not funded within our budget. So those are all costs that's absorbed. So that's not just personal services. So it's not just their salaries and wages and benefits. It's also, you know, buying them computers and like paying for their training and anything that is associated with having one kind of, I guess, PY on staff. So it would be that person. And we've kind of figured that it costs us about somewhere between 18 and 19,000 per year just for those operating costs for just to have people on staff. That's not a part of their actual salaries. That's separate from their salaries. So these carve outs have been really instrumental in paying for all those costs that we've been absorbing. And those limited term staff were really hired to help get these programs off the ground and get them going and keep them going too. So on the next slide, this one kind of brings us to this is our last slide. And this, well, that's okay. There we go. Okay. So this slide brings us to our position authority that we received in 22-23. So in total, we received 8 positions through the budget. So we received 1 research data specialist, 1 attorney 3, 1 staff services manager 3, 3 AGPAs, and then 2 program technicians. So we did, we were able to convert because, I did mention we had 23 LTs on staff. Some of these positions we already had current staff, we're able to convert them to permanent staff through receiving new position authority. And then the others are in the recruitment process right now to get to become filled. So I think, yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Looking into 22-23, now working in this kind of post-COVID environment. We're anticipating an increase in operational costs, primarily around travel and postage and printing, and really any general expenses. We're anticipating an increase in those areas. So I'm keeping a close eye on the trends so I can accommodate all of our operational needs, and then I'm able to kind of adjust our budget as things fluctuate and priorities emerge. But we're pretty early into the budget planning stages. Usually by October, I'll know where we stand and have a very good grasp of where we are and going forward. But right now I do have a general idea, and we're in a very good spot, especially with those carve outs. That has been very helpful to keep us within budget. And that's really what the goal is to meet all of our operational needs while staying in budget. So we're on track to doing that right now. And I think that ends our presentation. I can turn it over for any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Are there any questions from the commission? Commissioner Geog.
I have actually kind of a two-part. One is just on this presentation. Do we think in terms of programs like administration, outreach, awards, commission expenses, and in terms of somewhere in our books, do we know, growth of administration versus growth of programs versus just in terms of presentation? But this is a nice, detailed listing, if you will, but I don't get a sense of programmatic changes and where the money is. We did add people, thank you, at the first slide that went by before I could read it, which is difficult. Okay, so anyway, that's a question. And then the second question, and you can answer it as you want, and maybe it's a separate presentation, but are we into the budget change proposal business yet? Have we developed is it somewhere in the agenda and I've missed it? Is it in the agenda?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about budget change proposals eventually. But anyway, back to my first question then.
So definitely the growth of our budget is not proportionate to the money that we receive in state operations and our staff. So we have a $3.5 billion budget altogether, and our position authority right now is about 145 positions. We are able, which I didn't convey it in this presentation, but we do know the costs that are associated to each division and each program. So we have within our fiscal accounting system, we're able to designate each dollar that's spent on a program with that program or with the general area, or if it's in internal operations, what it falls under. So I do have, I can see that. I've tracked those trends and I see how much is spent on each program, and I can provide that to you in some sort of chart form if you'd like to see after this, if it's interesting to you. And I can provide that information, but we monitor exactly how much is spent on each program, and we don't necessarily do a forecast for that because these programs some of them are fairly new and it's kind of still, they're still prioritizing and figuring out what the program needs. But so there's not an actual like forecast for those. It's just mainly like a tracking mechanism that I use.
Okay, well, I might be, but if everybody else doesn't care, that's okay.
I see that Commissioner Day has a question.
Thank you. Just a clarification, or two questions. One's a clarification. What are we reimbursing other departments for? What are the services that we actually provide? That's one. The second question is really just to ask you, can you comment a little bit about, and I'm not sure if this is all in the Cal Grant delivery system or this may be more broader around IT security, where it's falling somewhere between permanent staff, consultative staff, and where we're headed with that. If you could just comment on that relative to the budget.
Well, for your first question, that was what we're able to reimburse on. So for contracts, it's really, so other departments, so we request reimbursement from 3 separate departments. So I guess I'll get as an example for the Chafee funds. So for the Chafee program, all of the funds for the Chafee program are with the Department of Social Services, but we disperse those funds and we, kind of regulate that program. So because the Department of Social Services has that money, they give it to us. So in order to, pay whatever the operational needs for that program, and for the grants for that program as well. So it kind of depends, but it's mainly, somebody else has the money, but we're doing the services for it. Regulating the programs for it. And then can you repeat your second question? I'm sorry.
I absolutely can't because I didn't have it the first time I said it.
Okay.
So I'm trying to get a handle in my head from a budgetary perspective on IT and IT security, because this is a behemoth that every organization is facing. And so I know we spent a lot of time on this and a lot of work, really good work has gone into this. And I'm trying to track where we are in terms of allocation to IT security relative to consultants versus permanent staff. Let's start there. I just want to be able to have a sense of where we're headed with regard to making sure that we have what we need in that space.
So a few things on that. The first thing is, so we have one information security officer that oversees our entire department's IT security. We also have a program called Tenable, I want to say, that we use to protect all of our data that is kind of like overseen by our security officer. The big thing, we know that more resources are needed. We understand that there is, our department is at could be at a major threat, and we hold on to a lot of data, and it's security, social security numbers, really important personal data. So you'll find out tomorrow, talking about the BCP process, we have one BCP that we are requesting through the Department of Finance just for cybersecurity. We have one dedicated to add additional staff for cybersecurity, as well as request money for consulting to have somebody help us determine like a roadmap, like where our deficiencies are right now in cybersecurity, and then how we can attain the most security as possible. So we've requested some upgraded software from that Tenable software. The Tenable is great, and it does it's definitely done its job and protected us, and it shows all of the red flags. But there is some better security software that we could potentially purchase if we had some additional money for that. So there is some things cybersecurity wise in the works right now, and you'll probably hear a little bit more about that BCP as well as the 3 other BCPs that we're proposing tomorrow.
What is a BCP?
That's the budget change proposal. So that's
Thank you.
the vehicle that we use to request Department of Finance to receive additional money. So usually, like every year, we start out with like a baseline budget, and if there's anything additional that we want to add to our baseline, then we have to submit this BCP or budget change request to the Department of Finance. For them to consider, and they go through that whole process and go through the legislature and finally get it approved to add to our budget. So what we submit for what we would be submitting to Department of Finance this in a couple of weeks is when they're due. That would actually be a part of next year's budget for the 22-23 or 23-24 budget. That's when we'd receive the funds and resources for those if they get approved.
If I can just also add on, thank you, Sandy, for that helpful description. I did want to say that the cybersecurity issue is a serious issue for us, and that's why you'll hear a lot more about it tomorrow when we talk about the budget change proposals, because the whole area is dedicated to that. But just want to let you know that the GDSM project, that did do a lot in building a much safer, secure environment for our data. But it's not enough, but we did take that step. So we have really made some significant inroads. The second thing that GDSM did is it put most of our operation in the cloud. And so what we have is a situation where we need staff with that particular expertise, which is a little challenging to find in state government. So a big priority for us in terms of the IT world is for us to kind of wean off of the contract work to help us with GDSM. But right now we're having to retain some of those contractors to help us with this very sophisticated work and that transfer of knowledge to our regular IT staff so that they learn how to operate in the cloud and do all the maintenance and operations for our system. So it is something that we've been spending a lot of time with. Catalina Missler, who's really serving as interim right now, has had her hands in this and really can speak to this a lot more. And I encourage you to talk to her about it. But it is a really critical area, and we are trying to wean off the contractors to be able to transfer those skills to our staff. But it is a slower process. And once we hopefully we'll be successful with our budget request to the governor's office, we will then be able to really build on that kind of expertise within our own ranks.
Thanks for that explanation. Any other questions from the commissioners? Seeing none, I'd like to open it up to the public. Is there any public comment on this agenda item? Not seeing any. I want to again thank you both for that great presentation and for updating us on the budget and everything going on with that area. So thanks so much. Moving on to our next agenda item number 7, which is potential agenda items for our future meetings. I'd like to open it up. Any new business for anybody that would like to consider? I would like, I've got one. I know that we've got the working group on undocumented students that's looking at how we support our undocumented scholars. I think with the federal decision to do some loan forgiveness, that is impacting only those students who were able to take out federal loans. But we have the California Dream Loan program here in the state. And just wondering what options we might be able to explore with the state of California about some loan forgiveness for our undocumented scholars who might have taken out one of those dream loans. But just throwing that out there as a potential area of exploration.
And Chair Neese, if I may, I'll just mention briefly that our meeting on Friday, the next and the 4th meeting of the Undocumented Student Affordability Work Group, we're looking at gaps in support and opportunities for undocumented students more broadly, including lack of access to federal financial aid, federally subsidized loans, and the lack of inclusion in any kind of debt cancellation or forgiveness. So your comments are very prescient ahead of that next work group meeting. And I'd be happy to share a little bit of an update perhaps at that next meeting if it's appropriate.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jake. I see Commissioner Mayer, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just raising an item for the future. I think following up on Chair Cifuentes' question around student housing, it'd be good to hear what's the latest in implementation of the $3 billion that were set aside for acquisition and renovation of, I think it's mostly market rate commercial properties, right? And then converting that for low-income student housing. But also I've heard that there's some innovation that's happening by campuses and by systems around meeting housing needs, potentially that we could learn from if we want to start exploring what we could do to help as a commission, as well as any legal research around Section 8 that can be done to give us at least the basic contours of what's the law of the land, what are the barriers, some of the initial barriers that we can spot. I think this might just be gradual education and awareness building within this committee and the broader commission about student housing issues.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. SB 169, I believe, was the Senate bill that allocated some funding for public post-secondary education to build more affordable housing, and just kind of how that process is moving forward, where those allocations are coming, and so it might be something for us to look into. So great. Any other potential time? All right, seeing none, I think that concludes our agenda. I'd like to, yes, Executive Director.
I wanted to take this moment to also thank Sandy and Lily for the work they've done on the budget. This is the way they have systematized our budget process is incredible. And I can rest easy at night knowing that they're monitoring every dollar we spend. I also want to acknowledge, because Lily doesn't have the opportunity to present very often, that she oversaw the move to this building from our former headquarters. And they were able to do yeoman's work in bringing all the equipment, furniture, internet without disruption to any of our programs or any of our business. And her team, it was both an IT and FASD team. They were the winners of the MVP awards, and every single person on her team that was part of the move got $250 award from the state of California for their incredible work. So thank you, Lily, and the whole team, and Sandy for doing an amazing job on the budget. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Any other final comments before we have a motion to adjourn? All right, seeing none, do I have a motion for adjournment?
A second.
Oh, was there a comment at the back? I'm sorry, did I miss? Okay.
No,
Okay.
motion, just motion.
Okay. So you got a motion and a second?
Yes.
All right, sounds good. Do we need to do a vote, or do we just able to adjourn? Sounds good.
Without objection.
All right, no objections. We are adjourned. Thanks, everyone.